Thanks very much indeed, and feel free just to switch everything off and I'll just raise my voice. Now, Scott says I'm going to give a critique of the ERB and where health and safety fits in, which I guess would take about 4 hours, and I'd also expose the fact that I'm neither an expert on health and safety law, nor, to be frank, looking at people like Des in the room, an expert on employment law either, although I should say, given that sounds quite modest, just a very quick anecdote. I live just over the water next to the old Daily Record building that's now been demolished. People might have seen it, so I walk past it every day. And I was walking past it with my partner, who's a trade unionist, and I said, listen, I don't really like the way they deconstruct these buildings from the top to the bottom. And I said, I don't really like the look of that internal bracing on that building. And she said, listen to you speak to a few health and safety reps, and your dad used to work in construction, and you think you know what you're talking about. Anyway, 24 hours later, the building collapsed, and 5 floors of my building was evacuated. So I kind of lost any correct modesty that I might have had in terms of my lack of knowledge, which now leaves me 14 minutes after that anecdote to try and run through. I think what I want to talk about is a few of the salient points about the Employment Rights Bill, with 2 big caveats. One particularly big caveat, which is we don't ultimately exactly know what it's going to say yet. So I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this. Incoming Labour government pledged within 100 days to introduce the New Deal for Workers, the Employment Rights Bill, which it did. The advantage, one might argue, of that, particularly if you see some of the policy flips that we've seen in government, both governments for a long time, is that they got in quickly. The downside of that, of course, is that it's a really expansive piece of work, and it's really hard to put legislation through, or even initiate legislation that's all-encompassing in 100 days. But I would argue that it's ambitious. I was at a parliamentary committee a few weeks ago, and the position I put forward at the moment is it's a good bill, but it could be great, and the kind of could be great is where we sit at the moment, because that hasn't been fulfilled. Where does health and safety fit? Sorry, I should say it's at its 3rd stage, or about to hit its 3rd stage at the moment. So it's had first reading, it's been through committee. We're going to find out very quickly what changes. We understand there's about 100 are going to be made at committee. It then goes back to Parliament and Lords stages. So there's a number of stages to go, and at this point we don't even know exactly what changes have been made from what was on the face of the original legislation. Where does health and safety fit in? At one level, you could say it doesn't, in the sense that the ERB doesn't seek to change the key underpinning health and safety legislation that we enjoy, and also, as Scott would say, critique. So at one level, not, but of course, that isn't the whole story, otherwise you wouldn't have invited me to speak about it. And what I want to touch upon, I guess, is 5 or 6 elements of a very broad-ranging bill. Caveat again, a bill that might change, and elements which could be better or worse depending on how they're finally implemented, that I think does have some significant relevance and deserves our particular attention. I mean, I guess the first one is fairly obvious. If we believe, as we do, that trade unionised workplaces are safer workplaces, then anything which strengthens trade unions should be seen as a positive and important for health and safety. So what we do see in the bill, as it currently stands, is mostly a 95, I would argue, % reversal of the 2015 Industrial Relations Act, which essentially placed all of those limitations on the right to strike. And whether you're a teacher balloting on violence in the workplace just now, or people who over the years have been forced to ballot over health and safety transgressions, it's quite clear that that matters. We need to hang on to this. Every single one of these clauses is subject to kickback from the business community just now, but that's where we are at the moment. On the face of the bill, there is a positive push back against the 2015 legislation. Secondly, access for unions to workplaces. The responsibility of the employer to inform new workers of their right to join a trade union, and simplified and easier ways to gain that recognition are all in the bill. However, they're all subject to further consultation. So one could imagine a fairly easy piece of legislation which says you have to be very clear on contracts with somebody of their right to join a union. Any reasonable request from a union to visit your workplace should be accepted, and a very simplified process should be put in place for seeking recognition thereafter. Or one can imagine a whole ream of bureaucracy around that, and this is what employer organisations are already looking at, which will essentially make that much more difficult than it sounds like in practice. But theoretically, a real positive, and obviously unionisation means safer workplaces, health and safety fits in. The third one, and I should say at this point, what we're not going to get in this bill, in my view, and I think in the view of most people, is the reform of the way that we treat employment status in the UK. So people will be aware, I'm sure, of the different statuses, self-employed worker and employee. For years now, and certainly since the Taylor Review, people have been saying that needs to change. Very obvious, workers with more status employ better employment rights, employ better protections under health and safety. That's not going to change. What we will see is some change around 0 hours contracts, and that matters for health and safety, because obviously being on a 0 hours contract essentially removes a whole swathe of your employment rights. It doesn't officially do it, but it unofficially does it, because if you complain, you find you haven't got any hours next week. Now, the employer won't say that it's because you've complained about X or you've complained about Y, but that will be the reason. So any contractual underpinning, again, I think we're going to have a struggle to make sure it's as good as it should be. But any contractual underpinning instead of a 0 hours contract, theoretically and hopefully in practice, improves the power of the individual worker and therefore the collective in the workplace. Just shut me up, Scott. I've got 3 more points that I want to make, but if I'm running too long. Statutory sick pay. Statutory sick pay matters enormously for health and safety. Presenteeism is a disaster. We saw it through COVID, but we still see it every day. So anything that mitigates against presenteeism, the financial need to present at work because you won't get compensation, that matters for health and safety. What we seem to be getting, and I think there's going to be changes between stage 1 and 2 here, what we seem to be getting is some protection for low-paid workers who aren't currently covered by SSP. What we're not getting is anything like the levels of statutory sick pay that are enjoyed by most of our European counterparts. So a kind of progression, but a real need after that to ensure that the kind of levels of SSP match the fact that there is some regularisation and some improvement for low-paid and part-time workers. Third-party harassment. This is an important one. So the bill, on the face of it, currently makes an employer far more responsible for third-party harassment, by which we mean you work in a bar, you're currently protected against being harassed by a workmate or your employer, but you're not protected at being harassed by a customer. So there are provisions in the bill which will increase the responsibility of the employer to ensure that the employee is not subjected to that. So that could mean, a better exclusion policy. It could be better proactive health and safety policy, better warning of clients, a whole range of responsibilities. Again, the caveat is how many of these things are going to be weakened and how many things are going to be kicked back against. But if we're talking about the face of the bill, there was potential protection for third-party harassment, which will mean a lot for really all customer-facing professions, particularly those in retail, in hospitality and others where unionisation isn't currently necessarily that high. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about at the moment is social care. So within the bill, social care, we had hoped for a lot more provision for collective bargaining in this bill. We had hoped that the coverage would be far wider than it is. However, there is some provision for collective bargaining in social care. Many of you who are involved in the movement generally, but social care in particular, will realise that in Scotland there's been some significant progress made through procurement legislation rather than through employment legislation to create the architecture for bargaining in social care. I hope I don't have to explain to people why that matters, but it matters in terms of pay, but it matters in terms of a whole range of other condition setting as well. In the bill as it currently stands, England is covered, and our view would be that it's largely a wage-setting mechanism that has been introduced. So you have collective bargaining, you can bring unions to the tables appointed by the Secretary of State, but largely they will talk about pay. In Scotland, the scope and the ambition is greater than that, so what we would call more proper collective bargaining, so collective bargaining that deals with pay but deals with a whole range of other terms and conditions. There is a battle on just now, one that we think we're doing all right in, there is a battle on just now to ensure that the powers to set the bargaining infrastructure for social care in Scotland rests with the Scottish Parliament. And that's partly to reflect our generalised view as the STUC that employment law and health and safety law should be devolved, but it's partially to reflect the fact that we've got a more progressional, more grassroots, more all-encompassing. We've got to a stage where we think that we've got employers and government and unions roughly in the same place as that. And that could be enormous if you think about it. So at the moment, obviously, in a social care workplace, you have the health and safety rights you enjoy, but the setting of health and safety standards through a national collective bargaining process could be incredibly important if we're able to win that and take it to the next stage. So listen, I'm going to shut up there. I mean, I hope through that people have understood that I think there are opportunities. There are good things on the face of the bill. They are all subject, or almost all of them subject to pressure that we're getting from business, which is why we need to keep our eye on it, to bureaucratic mechanisms that could make it worse for us than it currently is. And in every area there is a better or a worse outcome depending on what the legislation finally says. But it is something which I say is good but could be excellent, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.